The flowers on the altar were still fresh when my mother-in-law found me in the back row and smiled. Not a warm smile. The kind of smile a woman uses when she has already decided the outcome of something, and wants you to know it. The banquet hall of Calvary Ridge Church seated 300 people that evening. Every chair was filled. The mayor was in the 4th row. The Chamber of Commerce president was in the 6th. The man being honored at the front of the room had spent 30 years building the kind of reputation in this town that fills a room like this without effort. His name was Douglas Hale, my father-in-law. And the award sitting on the velvet table at the front was the Calvary Ridge Community Pillar, given once a decade to the family that best represented the values of service, integrity, and legacy that the church stood for. His name had been on the program for 6 weeks. The whole town had been talking about it. What the whole town did not know, what Douglas Hale did not know, was that the woman sitting in the back row in a plain gray coat had spent 11 months building a file, and that the file was in the envelope in her lap. My name is Celeste Hale. I am 34 years old and I am a forensic accountant. And I want to tell you about the night I stood up in a room of 300 people and let 11 months of quiet work do what 11 months of quiet work was always going to do. Welcome to Real Family Voices, where the truth always finds the room it was meant for. If you've ever been told to be grateful for what someone's family gave you, right before they tried to take everything, pull up a chair. This story belongs to you. Drop a comment, tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe. Because this is not a story about anger. It is a story about documentation. And documentation in the right room is the most powerful thing in the world. The flowers on the altar were still fresh when my mother-in-law found me in the back row. Let me tell you who I was before I tell you what I did. Because nothing about that evening makes sense unless you understand the kind of person who builds a file for 11 months and then walks into a crowded church and opens it. I am a forensic accountant. I have been one since I was 26. My job in its simplest form is to find the number that doesn't belong, the transaction that runs against the pattern, the figure that looks right until you hold it up to the light and see what's underneath it. I am methodical. I am patient. I do not make accusations I cannot support with paper. I married into the Hale family at 29, and I want to be fair about how that began. I loved my husband, Marcus, with the specific and certain love of someone who had been alone long enough to know what they actually wanted. He was steady and kind and he laughed easily and he called his parents every Sunday, which I found touching rather than complicated. First, the Hale family ran the largest private construction company in the county. Douglas had built it from a 2-man operation in a trailer behind the feed store to a firm with 60 employees, 3 divisions, and contracts on half the significant buildings in a 50-mile radius. He was genuinely accomplished. I want you to know that because what I'm about to tell you is not the story of a bad man pretending to be a good one. It's the story of a good man who had made one very specific, very deliberate decision, and spent 30 years letting someone else carry the cost of it. That someone else was a woman named Patrice. And I did not know she existed until the 11th month of my marriage, when a box arrived at our house addressed to Marcus in handwriting I did not recognize. Marcus was traveling for work when the box arrived. Brown cardboard, no return address, taped carefully the way a person tapes something they want to arrive intact. I set it on the kitchen counter and called him. He told me to leave it, that he'd open it when he got back. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard before. Not evasive exactly. Careful. I left it on the counter for 2 days. On the 3rd day, Marcus came home and opened it himself in the kitchen while I was washing dishes. I heard the tape come off, then a long silence, then the sound of him sitting down heavily in the chair that faces the window. I turned around. He was holding a photograph. Old, slightly faded, the color of photographs from the early 1990s. He set it on the table face up and pushed it toward me. It was a photograph of Douglas Hale, younger, thinner, in front of a building I didn't recognize. Standing beside him was a woman holding an infant. His arm was around her shoulder. He was smiling at the camera with the smile I recognized from 30 years of family portraits. On the back of the photograph, in that same careful handwriting from the address label, someone had written 3 lines. This is your father. This is your half-sister, Raina. She is 31 years old. She has been waiting her whole life for someone in your family to see her. I looked at my husband. Marcus's face was doing something I had never seen it do. Not shock exactly. Something older than shock. The face of a person who has been carrying a suspicion for years and just been handed proof. He told me then, sitting in our kitchen with the photograph between us, what he had known and what he had suspected and what he had been told never to ask about. There had always been a woman. Not a brief encounter. Not a mistake that ended cleanly. A woman Douglas had been with before his marriage. A relationship that had ended when Douglas chose his family's approval, and the company his father was about to sign over to him, and ended her. She had been pregnant when he left. He had known. His parents had known. His wife Marcus's mother Sylvia had known for at least 15 years. And Raina, the daughter born from that relationship, had grown up 30 miles from the Hale family's charitable events and community awards, in a house without her father's name, without his support, without a single acknowledgement from the family that sat in the front pew at Calvary Ridge every Sunday. For 31 years. I sat at my kitchen table with a photograph I had not been meant to open, and I felt the cold familiar feeling of a number that doesn't belong. Someone had carried this. 31 years of someone carrying this. And in 6 weeks, the town was going to give her father a medal for integrity. I want to pause here because I know what some of you are wondering. What was in the rest of the box? The answer is the reason I spent 11 months building a file instead of 11 minutes making a phone call. Stay with me. Because what Raina had assembled in that brown cardboard box was not a complaint. It was a case. And it changed everything I thought I understood about the word documentation. The photograph was on top. Underneath it was a letter, written by hand for pages, the handwriting the same careful script from the address label. Raina's handwriting. I know that now. She did not write with anger. That was the first thing I noticed. A woman who had every right to write with fury had written instead with precision. Dates. Names. Amounts. The structure of someone who had done this methodically, the way I would have done it. She described her mother's life after Douglas left. A woman named Gloria who had raised Raina alone on a teacher's salary, who had never sought legal recourse because Douglas's family had made it quietly, unmistakably clear that pursuing them would cost her the teaching position she held at the county school. A position that had been informally overseen by the board that Douglas's father chaired. The cost of speaking had been her livelihood. So Gloria had not spoken. She had raised her daughter and grown old and died the previous spring. And before she died she had given Raina the box. Inside the box, beneath the letter, were 31 years of documentation. Bank records showing small deposits into Gloria's account in the early years. Not support payments, too small and too irregular for that. But amounts that matched nothing in Gloria's income pattern. Amounts that came from a private account rather than any business. Enough to suggest Douglas had known, had tried in his limited way to acknowledge it, and had done so in a way that was deniable if anyone ever looked. Letters Gloria had written to Douglas and never sent, because she had known they would never reach him through his family. She had written them anyway, the way people write things they need to say even when there is no one to hear them. And at the very bottom of the box, a single legal document. A petition for paternity filed by Gloria 30 years ago, that had been dismissed, not because it was unfounded, but because the attorney she had been assigned could not locate the respondent for service. The respondent, Douglas Hale, had been findable. He was on the board of 2 local nonprofits, and had given a quoted interview to the county paper that same month. He had simply never been served. And Gloria, who could not afford to pursue it further without risking everything, had let it go. I sat at my kitchen table with 30 years of quiet evidence in my hands, and I thought about my job, about the numbers that don't belong, about what it means when a pattern has a gap in it, not because there was nothing there, but because someone deliberately made sure nothing could be found. I looked at my husband, who was still looking at the photograph. I said, "Marcus, do you want to know what's actually in this box?" He said yes. He meant it. We stayed at that table until 2 in the morning. I want to tell you about the 11 months because it was not a simple path and I did not walk it without doubt. Marcus and I spent the first 2 weeks in a kind of grief. Not for ourselves, we were fine, we were solid, we were the 2 people at the kitchen table who stayed until 2 in the morning, but for what the box contained. The specific grief of learning that the family you married into had a gap in it shaped like a person, and that the person had been 30 miles away their entire life. Marcus called Raina. That was his first and most important decision, and he made it before I said a word about any of the rest of it. He called her and they talked for 2 hours and then he came to find me and said she is real and she is careful and she does not want money. She wants to exist. She wants to exist. I sat with that for a long time. A 31-year-old woman who had grown up without her father's name in a town where his name was on buildings, who had watched her mother carry the silence for decades, who had assembled a careful box of evidence not to destroy anyone but simply to be seen. She wants to exist. I understood then what my job was in this. Not vengeance. Documentation. The same thing I did every day, except this time it was personal and this time it mattered more than any corporate audit I had ever run. I am going to be clear about the line I held because it mattered to me then and it matters to me now. I did not manufacture anything. I did not exaggerate anything. I did not take a piece of evidence and make it say more than it actually said. Every document in the file I eventually built was a real document that already existed, created by the people it reflected. I simply organized what was there, put it in order, made it legible. The way you make a set of books legible before you hand them to someone who needs to read them. Took 11 months because I did it right. I confirmed the bank records with a forensic trace that I knew how to run. I verified the dismissed paternity petition through court records. I had the letters assessed for handwriting by a professional who confirmed Gloria's authorship and the dates. I also found something Raina had not known was in the box. A single receipt from a private investigator, dated 18 years ago, showing that Douglas Hale had paid someone to locate Gloria and confirm she had not refiled the petition. He had checked. 18 years ago, he had paid someone to make sure the door was still closed. That receipt told me everything about the decision Douglas had made. Not a mistake that got away from him. A choice maintained, actively checked on for 18 years. I built the file. I organized it in sections. I made clean copies of everything and stored the originals somewhere safe. And then the church announced the Calvary Ridge Community Pillar, and the name at the top of the program was Douglas Hale, and the date was 6 weeks away. I looked at Marcus. He looked at me. Neither of us had to say the word church out loud. It was already in the room, the same way the truth was already in the room, waiting for the right moment to sit down. I need to stop here because I know what some of you are asking. Did you tell Marcus's mother? Did you go to Douglas first? Yes, we did both of those things. Because we were not trying to humiliate anyone in public. We were trying to give them the chance to do the right thing in private. What they did with that chance is why the file ended up in an envelope in a back pew. Stay with me. This part matters. We went to Douglas and Sylvia 8 days before the ceremony. Marcus requested a private dinner. He told them it was important. They arrived at our house with a bottle of wine and the particular ease of people who have not yet understood that the ground is shifting under them. We sat at the same kitchen table where the box had arrived 11 months before. And Marcus told them about Raina. He did not accuse. He did not shout. He laid the photograph on the table and he said her name and he said she exists and she has existed for 31 years and we know about the box. Sylvia's face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. Not surprise. Something older than surprise. The face of someone who had been waiting for this specific knock at the door for a very long time and had spent years rehearsing what they would say when it came. She said it had been a mistake a long time ago. She said Gloria had been taken care of. She said reopening it now would hurt everyone, including the children, meaning herself and Marcus and the family, not Raina, who was apparently not included in the category of children who could be hurt. Douglas said almost nothing. He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the photograph and did not deny a single thing Marcus said. I asked him quietly what he intended to do. He said he needed time. I said we did not have much time. 6 days to be specific. And here is the thing about Douglas Hale that I could not have known from the outside but understood completely in that kitchen. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had made one irreversible choice 30 years ago, and had spent his entire subsequent life performing the person he would have been if he hadn't made it. The awards, the community service, the front pew at Calvary Ridge, they were not cynical. They were penance. But penance you perform for yourself in public while the person you wrong sits 30 miles away unacknowledged, is not penance. It is reputation management. He asked us not to bring it to the ceremony. Marcus said that was not our decision alone to make. Douglas called Raina himself 2 days later. I know because she told Marcus. It was a short call. He said he was sorry. She said sorry after 31 years was a beginning, not an ending. He agreed to meet her after the ceremony. After the ceremony, he still intended to accept the medal. And that was the thing that told me what I needed to know about what the next 6 days required. I called Raina that night. I asked her one question. I asked her if she wanted to exist in this town with her name and her story intact, or if she wanted to remain a secret that Douglas managed on his own timeline for his own comfort. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I want to exist." I said, "Then come to the ceremony. Sit in the back row with us." She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to let the room see what's in the file." She was quiet again. Then she said, "Okay." The night of the Calvary Ridge Community Pillar was the clearest evening in 3 months. The kind of night that makes a building look more important than it is, all lit windows and clean lines against a dark sky. Marcus drove. Raina met us in the parking lot, quiet in a dark coat, and Marcus hugged her for the first time in person. I watched them standing in the parking lot in the cold and understood that whatever happened in the next hour, that moment had already made the file worth building. We went in and took the back pew. Raina between us. 3 people in a row that nobody was paying attention to, because the front of the room was where the mayor was sitting and the program was already running. Sylvia found me 10 minutes in. She came to the back on the pretense of greeting a neighbor and leaned down to where I sat and said quietly, barely above a whisper, that she hoped I would remember whose family I had married into before I did anything foolish. I said I hoped she would remember whose daughter she had left 30 miles away for 31 years. She went back to the front row. The program moved through its stages. Testimonials from the chamber president. A video reel of the Hale Company's community projects. Photographs on a screen of Douglas at groundbreakings and ribbon cuttings and charity events, his name on the bottom of each one in white letters. And then the pastor, a young man named Pastor Ellison who I believe then and believe now was entirely sincere in everything he said, stepped to the microphone and asked Douglas Hale to come forward to receive the Calvary Ridge Community Pillar. Douglas stood. The room rose with him, 300 people on their feet, and the applause was genuine, which told me something important about how completely the story he had been telling had worked. Pastor Ellison lifted the medal from the velvet cushion. And from the back row, in the gap that opened between applause and the moment the medal reached Douglas's neck, I stood up and said clearly, carrying my voice the way you learn to carry it in a room that matters, "Pastor Ellison, may I address the congregation before the presentation?" The room turned. The way rooms turn when a voice comes from an unexpected direction. Pastor Ellison looked at me with the open expression of a man who had not been prepared for this, and was deciding in real time what kind of pastor he wanted to be in the next 10 seconds. He said, "This is a time of community witness. Come forward, please." Douglas did not look at me. He looked at the mayor, then at Sylvia, and I watched something pass between them that had the quality of a final calculation. I walked up the center aisle in my plain gray coat with my plain envelope. Raina stayed in the back row. That had been her choice and I respected it completely. Her job tonight was simply to exist in the room, and she was doing it. I stood at the microphone beside the velvet table where the medal still sat on its cushion, and I faced 300 people and kept my voice as level as I keep it when I am reading findings to a board of directors. I said I wanted to speak to the Hale family's legacy, because I believed this congregation deserved to know what they were honoring. I said that 11 months ago a box arrived at our home, that inside it was a photograph, a set of documents, and 31 years of evidence that the Hale family had another member. A daughter. A woman named Raina who had grown up in this county without her father's name or his acknowledgement while her father's name went on buildings, and her father's face appeared on programs like the one in everyone's hands. I opened the envelope. I held up the photograph first, the one from the box, Douglas and Gloria and the infant, so the candlelight caught it. I said this was taken before Marcus was born. I said the woman holding the baby was Gloria, who had died the previous spring. I said the baby was Raina, who was sitting in the back row of this church right now. The room turned and looked. And Raina in her dark coat simply sat. Present. Seen. I set the photograph on the edge of the velvet table and I held up the paternity petition, the one dismissed 30 years ago for failure to serve a man who had given a quoted interview to the county paper the same month. I said I wanted to read the date of this document and the date of the newspaper interview, because they were 7 days apart and both were a matter of public record. I read them both. Then I held up the private investigator's receipt. I said this was a payment made by Douglas Hale 18 years ago, to confirm that the petition had not been refiled. I said this was not a man who had made a mistake and forgotten about it. This was a man who had checked. I set the documents down. The room was so quiet I could hear the candles. I looked at Pastor Ellison, who was standing very still with the medal in his hands, and I said, I am not here to tell this congregation what to do. I am here to give them what they need to make an honest decision. Because integrity is the word on the program, and integrity requires the whole picture. Then I stepped back from the microphone. Douglas did not speak. He stood at the front of the room, and for the first time in 30 years the story he had been telling did not have enough room for all the people in it, and the room could see exactly where it was tight. Sylvia rose from the front pew, and her voice, when it came, had the quality of a structure giving way under pressure it had held too long. She said Celeste had no right, that this was a private family matter, that I was airing things that belonged behind closed doors. The mayor in the fourth row looked at his program, then looked at the back row where Raina was sitting, then put his program down on the seat beside him. The Chamber of Commerce president said nothing. He simply did not look at Douglas. Pastor Ellison held the medal for a long moment. Then he set it back on the velvet cushion. He said that the presentation would be postponed pending the church board's review of the circumstances that had been brought to light. He said he believed in grace and in restoration, but that a pillar of integrity required the full story, and tonight the full story was larger than the program had accounted for. Douglas said, to no one in particular, in a voice that had gone completely flat, that he needed some air. He walked out the side door. Sylvia followed, and the sound of the door closing behind them was the quietest thing that had happened all evening. Marcus stood up from the back row and walked to where Raina was sitting. He sat down beside her. She did not cry, and neither did he. They just sat together in the back of the church their father had attended for 30 years, two people who had the same blood and had never once been in the same room, now in the same room. I walked back down the center aisle and sat on the other side of Raina. The three of us stayed there while the congregation quietly assembled themselves around the reality of what had just happened. A woman from the third row whom I did not know came to the back and sat in the pew ahead of us and turned around and said to Raina, "Your mother raised you right to come here like this. I can tell." Raina said she did. She really did. The Calvary Ridge Community Pillar was not presented that year. The church board voted 3 weeks later to retire the honor entirely, citing the recognition that no family's reputation is a simple enough thing to be awarded in a ceremony, and that the congregation was better served by humility than by crowns. Douglas met Raina for dinner the following month. Marcus and I were not there. It was not our meeting. We know it happened because Raina told us, and we know it was difficult, and we know it did not resolve 30 years in one evening because 30 years cannot be resolved in one evening. But it happened. She sat at a table with her father and he used her name. That was the beginning. Sylvia and I have not spoken since the ceremony, and I do not expect that to change soon. What I have come to understand about my mother-in-law is the same thing I understood sitting in my kitchen with the box. She knew, and she chose the version of the family that served the family, and she is the kind of woman who will defend that choice long after the cost of it has been tallied by everyone else. I cannot make her different. I can only be different. Marcus and I are good. Better, actually, than before the box arrived, which is the strange and true thing about uncovering a hard truth with someone you trust. You find out what the partnership is actually made of, and if it is made of the right things it holds. Raina came to our house for Christmas. She and Marcus stayed up until 1 in the morning going through photographs of their father as a young man, learning the person from the outside in. I made coffee and went to bed and listened to them talking through the wall, and I thought about Gloria and her careful handwriting in the box she had spent 30 years building. She had not built it for revenge. She had built it so her daughter would eventually have the evidence she needed to be seen. And on a December evening in a candlelit church, her daughter had been seen by 300 people. In the town where her father's name was on buildings. That was what Gloria had wanted. I think now it was all she had ever wanted. If someone has spent years telling you that the right thing to do is stay quiet, stay grateful, stay in the version of the story that serves them, I want you to hear something. Quiet is a choice. And like all choices, it belongs to you. You can be quiet in the service of healing. You can be quiet to protect someone who deserves protection. You can be quiet because the moment is not right and you are building toward the moment that is. What you do not have to be is quiet in the service of a reputation that was built on your erasure. The file took 11 months. The envelope took 3 minutes. And the thing that changed in that church was not just a story about Douglas Hale. It was the thing that changed for Raina when 300 people turned around and saw her sitting in the back row. She had existed her whole life. That night the room finally knew it. If you are someone who has been existing quietly in a room that keeps leaving you out of the frame, I see you. And I hope you are building your file. Drop a comment and tell me about the room you're waiting to walk into. I read everyone. Subscribe to Real Family Voices, because next week we are sitting with a woman whose family removed her from their business partnership documents while she was in the hospital. And what she found when she was finally well enough to read the paperwork changed everything about how she understood the word family. I will see you then.